In our fifth story, Republican leaders and those who would join them making new calls of no compromise and of government shutdown. While in Alaska, a sign of clarity as the Tea Party candidate drops to third place in polling there. The Republican who felt he had no choice but to become an independent. Florida governor and senatorial candidate Charlie Crist will join me in a moment as news breaks around that race. First, the Tea Party-backed senatorial candidate in Utah, Mike Lee, now says that a government shutdown may be absolutely necessary.
Our current debt is a little shy of $14 trillion, and I don't want it to increase 1 cent above the current debt limit, and I will vote against that.
Even if it leads to a government default or a shutdown?
It's an inconvenience. It would be frustrating to many, many people, and it's not a great thing. And yet, at the same time, it's not something that we can rule out. It may be absolutely necessary.
Meantime, the would-be Speaker of the House, John Boehner, has made it clear that working with the president only works in one direction. To quote him, to the extent the president wants to work with us in terms of our goals, we'd welcome his involvement. And he added this.
This is not a time for compromise, and I can tell you, Sean, that we will not compromise on our principles, and we will not compromise on the will of the American people. It's as simple as that.
Add Republican Mike Pence to the chorus. He says that when Republicans took control of the Congress back in 1994, quote, there was altogether too much compromise. There will be no compromise. But then there is Senator Lisa Murkowski, the Republican who's not crazy enough for the Tea Partiers and who is consequently running as a write-in candidate. The Alaska Supreme Court has now ruled that voters may review a list of write-in candidates at polling places, which would be vital to Murkowski, probably, since voters must spell her name correctly for that write-in vote to count. And a new poll in Alaska places her at the top. The Democrat Scott McAdams is second, and the Tea Party Republican Joe Miller is last. And as the stomach turns, the underbelly of the rest of Campaign 2010 shows itself in the Senate race in Washington, where Republican Dino Rossi is challenging the Democratic incumbent Patty Murray. A 23-year-old activist, Christy Storter, was protesting outside the GOP headquarters in Walla Walla. Ms. Storter, along with others, wearing bags over their heads. 72-year-old Victor Phillips tried to remove the bag, according to a sheriff's report. When Ms. Storter lifted her arms in defense, Mr. Phillips hit her arms with force. A sheriff's deputy arrested Mr. Phillips at the scene for a possible assault charge. In Houston, a despicable attempt at dirty tricks. A flyer stuck in the windshields of cars at a predominantly African-American polling place in Houston. The flyer tells voters not to vote the straight Democratic ticket and offers a convoluted explanation that also insults the intelligence of African-American voters. And in California, empathy abounds. The Republican nominee for Governor, Meg Whitman, has now declared that her former housekeeper of 9 years, the one who Whitman claims not to have known was an illegal immigrant, should now be deported. Let's go first to the Washington editor of The Nation, MSNBC contributor Chris Hayes. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, Keith.
We'll skip Ms. Whitman in her attempt to lose absolutely all of the Hispanic vote in California and move instead to this business of government shutdown and no compromise. The Republicans and the Tea Party tail that might be wagging that dog, are they now tipping just how far they will go if they get the House?
Look, I mean, think about it this way, right? In 1994, Republicans took over the House, and it was, you know, it was the sort of, in some ways, there's sort of a deja vu feeling to this whole Tea Party movement. Back then, it was called the Revenge of the Angry White Man. They didn't have the Tea Party moniker, and they shut down the government then, right? Now, think about this. This was 1994. Fox News goes on the air in October 1996. So they did not have Fox News egging them on. They didn't have this very organized, extremely well-funded wing of the conservative movement that was issuing primary challenges routinely to anyone that showed even the slightest inkling of compromise. So even before all these things were laid in place to create disincentives for compromise, they already did it once. So it's very hard to see how this is going to play out in a manner any more compromising or any more rational than the most the most extreme pursuit of ideological purity.
So what is the political calculation here by Mr. Boehner, for instance? Is that this hinting about shutting it down? Is that what he thinks the base needs to hear? Yes. To lock them in and keep him in charge, by the way, in case there's a Tea Party revolt against him as leader?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I mean, look, particularly down the last week of an election, on both sides of the aisle, everybody's focused on their base because they're focused on turnout, and that's what we're seeing in terms of the choices that President Barack Obama has made in terms of who he's granting interviews to. It's Boehner going on Hannity, so that is a dog whistle to the base. And the fact of the matter is there are going to be expectations. I mean, everyone that goes to Congress that's sworn in on January is going to be able to look at the example of Murkowski, whether she gets in or not, Christ, Mike Castle, and Bennett in Utah. And those are 4 people that were taken out because they were perceived as insufficiently deferential to the most conservative elements of the coalition. Now, even if some of them, even if Murkowski is triumphant ultimately, the fact of the matter is no one wants a primary challenge. It's an incredibly effective way of enforcing a certain kind of ideological discipline. And the people that show up with them, every single Republican member is going to have that lodged in their memory on day one.
What, speaking of Alaska, what do you make of that polling there, which not only shows Murkowski ahead, but McAdams significantly ahead of Joe Miller in 3rd place?
The Hayes poll is a little hard because polling is so difficult in this race, as everyone has said. What does seem reliable is that Miller has had 2 or 3 weeks of terrible press coverage, and his disapprovals across the board, that's an easier thing to poll, and his disapprovals have gone up. So I think Miller is in real trouble. The question is what the mechanics of this write-in prove to be in terms of how many of those ballots come out actually counting for Murkowski. If McAdams ends up with winning the race, I mean, that really is a sort of shoot yourself in the foot moment for the Republicans.
And a spelling exam for the entire state of Alaska.
Yeah, and it's not an easy one.
Well, MU. Okay, if you got that far, you're probably home free. Chris Hayes of The Nation. Thank you, Chris.